The fluorescent lights in the examination room buzzed with a persistent hum that Dr. Sarah Chen had long since stopped hearing. Though tonight the sound seemed to drill directly into her skull with a particular insistence that came from 14 hours on her feet and 3 emergency surgeries that had bled into one another without pause. Her scrubs carried the faint copper scent of blood beneath the sharper notes of antiseptic, and her hands ached from the endless cycle of scrubbing and glove changes. But she pressed her palm against the stainless steel examination table to steady herself as she reviewed the lab results on her tablet one more time, hoping the numbers would somehow rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. They didn't. The golden retriever puppy on the table before her, no more than 8 months old, with fur that should have been glossy and eyes that should have been bright, lay motionless except for the shallow, labored rise and fall of his ribcage. Parvo. Advanced, aggressive, and in a dog this young, with this level of dehydration and internal bleeding, the prognosis was grim enough that Sarah had already begun composing the conversation she would need to have with the owner. She had given this speech before, more times than she wanted to count, but it never got easier, especially not at 1 in the morning, when exhaustion stripped away the professional distance that usually helped her through these moments. The door to the exam room opened without warning, and Sarah looked up from her tablet to see her receptionist, Jamie's face, pale and tense, in a way that immediately sharpened Sarah's attention, despite her fatigue. Jamie had been working at the clinic for 5 years and had seen everything from routine checkups to horrific emergencies, and very little rattled her anymore. "Dr. Chen," Jamie said quietly, her voice carefully neutral in the way that meant she was working hard to keep it that way. "There's someone here about the puppy. You should probably come out front." Something in Jamie's expression made Sarah's stomach tighten, but she nodded and stripped off her gloves, following her receptionist through the narrow hallway that connected the exam rooms to the small waiting area of her clinic. Through the doorway, Sarah could see a man standing in the center of the room, and her first impression was of size and stillness. He was tall enough that he seemed to fill the space, broad-shouldered beneath an expensive charcoal suit that was somehow both impeccably tailored and slightly disheveled, as though he had been somewhere important before this and hadn't bothered to straighten himself. His dark hair was styled but messy, one hand raking through it repeatedly, and even from this distance, Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid set of his jaw. But it was the little girl beside him who made Sarah's heart contract painfully in her chest. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with dark curls pulled into a messy ponytail and enormous brown eyes swimming with tears that tracked steadily down her round cheeks. She wore purple pajamas printed with unicorns, and her small hand clutched her father's with desperate strength, while her other arm wrapped around a stuffed golden retriever that was almost as big as she was. The man's eyes locked onto Sarah the moment she stepped into the waiting room, and she felt the impact of that gaze like a physical thing, dark and intense, and burning with something that might have been anger, or might have been fear, or might have been both. His jaw was shadowed with stubble, and there was something dangerous in the planes of his face, something that made Sarah's instincts whisper warnings even as she straightened her spine and moved toward them with the professional calm she had spent years perfecting. "I'm Dr. Chen," she said, pitching her voice to be gentle despite the way her heart was hammering. "You're here about the puppy?" The little girl made a small broken sound and pressed her face against her father's side, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs that she was clearly trying to suppress. The man's hand moved to cup the back of her head, his large palm covering her dark curls with unexpected gentleness, and when he spoke, his voice was rough, each word seeming to cost him something. "Marco," he said simply, as though Sarah should know what that meant, and perhaps she should have. There was something about him that suggested consequence, that suggested people knew his name and stepped carefully around it. "This is my daughter, Isabella. Her dog, Bailey. He's been sick for 2 days. She wouldn't let me bring him in sooner, said he'd be fine. But tonight—" He stopped, his jaw clenching hard enough that Sarah could see the muscle jump beneath his skin. Tonight he collapsed. Sarah crouched down slowly, bringing herself to Isabella's eye level, and the little girl turned her tear-streaked face toward her with an expression of such desperate hope that Sarah had to swallow hard against the tightness in her throat. "Hi, Isabella," she said softly. "Bailey is a beautiful name for a dog. Did you pick it?" Isabella nodded, her lower lip trembling, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "He's my best friend. Is he going to be okay?" This was the moment Sarah had been dreading since she had first seen the lab results, but she forced herself to hold Isabella's gaze as she answered, because this little girl deserved honesty even if it broke both their hearts. "Isabella, Bailey is very sick. He has something called parvovirus, which is a disease that attacks his stomach and intestines. I've given him medicine and fluids to try to help him feel better, but—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes, even when we do everything we can, the sickness is too strong." "But you're a doctor," Isabella said, her voice rising with panic, even as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "You fix animals. That's what you do. Daddy said you're the best veterinarian in the city, that if anyone can help Bailey, it's you. So you have to save him. You have to." Sarah glanced up at Marco and found him watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. His expression was shuttered, controlled, but she could see the tension vibrating through him, could see the way his free hand had curled into a fist at his side. He looked like a man who was accustomed to solving problems through force of will or force of something else, and the helplessness of this situation was clearly tearing him apart from the inside. "I'm going to do everything I possibly can," Sarah said to Isabella, and she meant it, even though she knew the odds were stacked impossibly high against them. "But I need you to understand that Bailey is very, very sick, and sometimes—" "Promise me," Isabella interrupted, her small voice suddenly fierce despite the tears. She pulled away from her father and grabbed Sarah's hands with both of hers, her grip surprisingly strong for such a tiny person. "Promise me you'll save him. Please. I'll do anything. I'll be good forever. I'll never ask for anything else. Just please, please save Bailey." The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt the weight of them settling onto her shoulders like a physical burden. She could feel Marco's gaze burning into her, could sense Jamie hovering anxiously in the doorway behind her, but all of that faded into background noise against the raw desperation in Isabella's eyes. This was why she had become a veterinarian, why she had spent years studying and training and learning to navigate the impossible space between hope and honesty. But nothing in her education had prepared her for this moment, for the impossible promise that a 6-year-old girl with a dying puppy was demanding from her. "Isabella," Sarah started, but the little girl shook her head violently, her grip on Sarah's hands tightening. "Promise," Isabella whispered, her voice breaking. "Please. He's all I have. Since Mommy died, Bailey's been the only one who— Please. Promise." Sarah's breath caught in her chest, her eyes darting involuntarily to Marco's face. Something flickered across his expression. Pain, old and deep and carefully controlled, before his features smoothed back into that dangerous stillness. His hand rested on Isabella's shoulder, heavy and protective, and for just a moment Sarah saw past the expensive suit and the threatening presence to the raw grief of a father watching his child suffer and being utterly powerless to stop it. She should say no. She should explain gently but firmly that she couldn't make promises about outcomes, that medicine didn't work that way, that hope was one thing but false hope was cruel. But Isabella's hands were trembling in hers, and Marco's eyes held a desperation that matched his daughter's. And Sarah found herself saying words she knew she might regret, words that committed her to attempting the impossible. "I promise I will fight for Bailey with everything I have," she said quietly. "I won't give up on him, Isabella. Not as long as there's any chance at all." It wasn't quite the promise Isabella had demanded, but the little girl's face crumpled with relief, and she threw her arms around Sarah's neck, sobbing into her shoulder with the abandon of a child who had been holding herself together by force of will alone. Sarah wrapped her arms around the small, shaking body automatically, one hand rubbing slow circles on Isabella's back, the way her own mother used to do when Sarah was young and frightened. Over the child's head, she met Marco's gaze and saw something shift in those dark eyes. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude, or something more complicated that she didn't have the energy to parse right now. "Thank you," Marco said, his voice rough with an emotion he was clearly fighting to contain. "Whatever it costs, whatever you need, money isn't an issue, just, please." Sarah gently extracted herself from Isabella's grip and stood, her knees protesting the movement after so many hours on her feet. "Let me take you back to see him," she said, "and then I need to get back to work." She led them through the hallway to the exam room, where Bailey lay on the table, still and small beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Isabella rushed to the puppy's side, her hand hovering over his head, as though afraid to touch him, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks when Bailey's tail gave one weak thump against the metal surface. "He knows me," Isabella whispered. "See, Daddy? He knows I'm here." Marco moved to stand behind his daughter, his hands resting on her shoulders, and when he looked at Sarah, there was something almost vulnerable in his expression, despite the dangerous edge that never quite left his features. "What do you need from us?" "I need to keep him here overnight, maybe longer," Sarah said, already running through treatment protocols in her mind. "I'll start aggressive fluid therapy and antiemetics to control the vomiting, antibiotics to prevent secondary infection. If we can get him stable, if we can get him through the next 48 hours. She trailed off, unwilling to make promises she wasn't certain she could keep. "And if you can't?" Marco's voice was flat, carefully devoid of emotion, but Sarah could hear the fear beneath it. "Then I'll make sure he doesn't suffer," Sarah said quietly. "But I meant what I told Isabella. I'm not giving up." Marco studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes moving over her face with an intensity that made her acutely aware of how she must look, exhausted and rumpled, her dark hair escaping from its ponytail, shadows under her eyes that spoke of too many late nights and too few breaks. But whatever he saw in her expression seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded slowly and pulled out his phone. "Give me your number," he said, and it wasn't quite a command, but it wasn't quite a request either. "I want updates, every hour." Sarah raised her eyebrows slightly at the presumption, but found herself reciting her cell number anyway. There was something about Marco that made it difficult to refuse him, some quality of absolute certainty that suggested he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. But beneath that dangerous authority, she could see the cracks, the way his hand shook slightly as he entered her number into his contacts, the tightness around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and helpless fear. "Come on, baby girl," Marco said to Isabella, his voice gentling considerably as he touched her shoulder. "We need to let Dr. Chen work. Bailey needs her to make him better." "But I want to stay with him," Isabella protested, her hand still hovering protectively over the puppy. "What if he gets scared? What if he needs me?" Sarah crouched down beside Isabella again, meeting those desperate brown eyes with as much reassurance as she could muster. "I'll be with him all night," she said. "I promise he won't be alone, and as soon as it's safe for you to visit, your dad will bring you back. Okay?" Isabella's lower lip trembled, but she nodded and leaned down to press a careful kiss to Bailey's head. "I love you," she whispered to the puppy. "You have to fight, okay? You have to get better. Dr. Sarah promised." The weight of that statement settled over Sarah like a heavy cloak as Marco gently guided his daughter toward the door. At the threshold, Isabella turned back one more time, her eyes finding Sarah's across the exam room. "Thank you for saving him," she said with the absolute conviction of a child who believed that promises were unbreakable and that adults could fix anything. Sarah could only nod, her throat too tight for words, And then they were gone, and she was alone with the dying puppy and the impossible promise she had made. She moved to Bailey's side and rested her hand gently on his rib cage, feeling the fragile flutter of his heartbeat beneath her palm. "Well," she said softly to the unconscious puppy, "I guess we'd better get to work." The next 72 hours blurred together in a haze of round-the-clock treatment and desperate monitoring. Sarah moved through her regular appointments on autopilot during the day, her mind constantly returning to the small room at the back of the clinic where Bailey lay hooked up to IV fluids and monitors. She had called in favors from colleagues, researched experimental treatments, pushed the boundaries of conventional protocols in ways that would have made her veterinary school professors either proud or horrified. And every hour, like clockwork, her phone buzzed with a text from Marco. "How is he?" The messages were always brief, always the same question, phrased in slightly different ways, but Sarah could feel the fear behind them. She responded each time with honest updates: his temperature, his hydration levels, whether he had eaten anything, whether he had shown any signs of improvement. She didn't sugarcoat the reality that Bailey was still in critical condition, that the next few days would determine whether he lived or died. But she also made sure Marco knew that she was there, that she was fighting, that she hadn't given up. On the second night, when Sarah had been awake for nearly 40 hours straight and was seriously considering just sleeping on the floor beside Bailey's kennel, her phone rang instead of buzzing with a text. She answered without checking the caller ID, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Dr. Chen." "It's Marco." His voice was deeper over the phone, rough around the edges in a way that suggested he hadn't been sleeping much either. "I'm outside. Can I come in?" Sarah glanced at the clock, 2:47 a.m., and then at her reflection in the darkened window of the exam room. She looked like hell, but she was too tired to care. "Yeah, the door's unlocked." She met him in the waiting room, and the sight of him stopped her short for a moment. He had clearly come straight from wherever he had been earlier. The suit was gone, replaced by dark jeans and a black Henley that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his build. His hair was disheveled, as though he had been running his hands through it repeatedly, and the shadows under his eyes matched her own. He carried 2 large coffee cups and a white paper bag that smelled like something from an expensive bakery. "I figured you hadn't eaten," he said without preamble, holding out one of the coffees. "Jamie told me you've been here since before Isabella and I brought Bailey in. That's, what, 3 days?" 73 hours, Sarah corrected automatically, accepting the coffee with a gratitude that was almost painful. The first sip was perfect, strong and hot with just a touch of cream, exactly how she liked it, though she had no memory of ever telling him that. "How's Isabella?" Marco's expression tightened, pain flickering across his features before he controlled it. "Not sleeping, barely eating. She keeps asking about Bailey, asking when she can see him." He paused, his jaw clenching. "She thinks I can fix anything. That's what fathers are supposed to do, right? Fix things, make everything better. But I can't fix this. I can't." He stopped, seeming to realize he was saying too much, revealing too much. Sarah studied him in the dim light of the waiting room, this dangerous man who wore expensive suits and had eyes that suggested he had seen and done things she couldn't imagine, and saw only a father who was terrified of failing his daughter. "You brought her here," she said quietly. "That was the right thing to do. That's all any of us can do sometimes, bring the people we love to someone who might be able to help." Marco's dark eyes found hers, and for a moment the air between them felt charged with something Sarah was too exhausted to name. "Can I see him? Bailey?" She should say no. It was the middle of the night. Visiting hours were long over, and she had protocols to follow. But something in Marco's expression, that vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide, made her nod and gesture for him to follow her. Bailey was awake when they entered the recovery room, which was both encouraging and concerning. His eyes were brighter than they had been 3 days ago, but he was still painfully thin, still weak, still very much in danger. When he saw Marco, his tail gave a feeble wag that made Sarah's chest tighten with something that might have been hope. Marco moved to the kennel with surprising gentleness for such a large man, crouching down to bring himself to the puppy's level. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "You're fighting, aren't you? Good boy. That's a good boy. Isabella needs you to keep fighting." He reached through the bars of the kennel to let Bailey sniff his hand, and the puppy's tongue darted out in a weak attempt to lick his fingers. Something in Marco's expression cracked, just for a moment, and Sarah saw the raw grief that he usually kept locked away. His daughter had lost her mother, and now she was facing the loss of the one thing that had helped her through that grief, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to protect her from that pain. "He's showing improvement," Sarah said quietly, moving to stand beside Marco. His blood work from this afternoon showed his white cell count stabilizing. He kept down some bland food. It's not a guarantee, but it's more hope than we had 2 days ago. Marco looked up at her, still crouched beside the kennel, and the gratitude in his eyes was almost painful to witness. "You're killing yourself for him," he said, his gaze moving over her face with an intensity that made her acutely aware of how close they were standing. "When's the last time you went home?" "I live upstairs," Sarah said, which wasn't really an answer. The truth was that she had an apartment above the clinic, but she couldn't remember the last time she had actually been up there for more than a quick shower and a change of scrubs. "I'm fine." "You're exhausted," Marco said flatly. He stood slowly, unfolding to his full height, and suddenly Sarah was very aware of how much bigger he was than her, how the recovery room felt smaller with both of them in it. "You need to rest." "I need to monitor Bailey," Sarah countered, lifting her chin stubbornly. "His condition could deteriorate at any moment, if I'm not here." "Then you set an alarm and come running," Marco interrupted. "But you're no good to him or Isabella if you collapse from exhaustion." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "Please, for Isabella's sake if not your own, she needs you at your best." The "please" surprised Sarah enough that she found herself nodding, and some of the tension left Marco's shoulders. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, pressing it into her hand. The card was simple, expensive-looking, with just a name, Marco Castellano, and a phone number. "Anything you need," he said quietly. "Equipment, supplies, consultation with specialists. I don't care what it costs, whatever gives Bailey the best chance." "And Sarah?" He waited until she met his eyes before continuing. "Thank you for fighting for him, for keeping your promise to Isabella. That means more than I can say." The use of her first name did something strange to her chest, made her heart beat just a little faster, and suddenly Sarah was very aware that they were alone in a small room in the middle of the night, that Marco was standing close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle with notes of cedar and spice. She could see the faint lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than his current serious expression indicated, could see the shadow of stubble along his jaw that somehow only made him more attractive rather than less. "I should go," Marco said, but he didn't move immediately, his dark eyes still locked on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Will you call me if anything changes? Anything at all?" "I promise," Sarah said, and then felt her cheeks heat at the echo of the promise she had made to Isabella. But Marco's expression gentled, and he reached out to brush his thumb across her cheek in a gesture that was over almost before it began. "Get some rest, dottoressa," he said softly, the Italian endearment rolling off his tongue in a way that made Sarah's stomach flip. Then he was gone, leaving her alone with the sleeping puppy and a rapidly cooling cup of coffee and the lingering warmth where his thumb had touched her skin. Bailey improved steadily over the next few days, defying the odds with a stubbornness that Sarah couldn't help but admire. He began eating on his own, keeping down food and water, showing the first signs of the playful energy that should have characterized a puppy his age. Sarah allowed herself to hope, allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could actually keep the impossible promise she had made to a desperate little girl. Marco came by every evening, always after Isabella was asleep, always carrying coffee and food that Sarah was beginning to suspect he was getting specifically because he had noticed what she liked. They fell into a routine. He would visit Bailey, giving the puppy gentle encouragement in that rough, soft voice, and then he would sit with Sarah in the small break room while she ate, and they would talk. About nothing important at first, the weather, the neighborhood, the challenges of running a small business. But gradually, inevitably, the conversations deepened. She learned that Marco's wife had died in a car accident 2 years ago, that Isabella had been in the car, but survived with only minor injuries, that the trauma had left his daughter quiet and withdrawn until Bailey came into their lives 6 months ago. She learned that Marco ran a family business that he didn't elaborate on, but the careful way he said it, and the dangerous edge that never quite left his eyes, told Sarah everything she needed to know about what that actually meant. She learned that he had grown up in this neighborhood, that he was trying to give Isabella a normal childhood despite the circumstances of their life, that he would do absolutely anything to protect his daughter from further pain. In return, Sarah found herself sharing things she rarely talked about: the way she had wanted to be a veterinarian since she was Isabella's age, the pressure of running her own practice in an expensive city, the loneliness of dedicating her life so completely to her work that there was little room for anything else. She told him about the cases that haunted her, the ones she couldn't save despite her best efforts, the way she sometimes felt like she was carrying the grief of every owner who had ever entrusted their beloved pet to her care. Marco listened with an intensity that suggested he was really hearing her, not just waiting for his turn to talk, and something fragile and precious began to grow between them in those late-night conversations. Sarah found herself looking forward to his visits, found herself watching the clock as evening approached, and wondering if tonight would be the night he didn't come. But he always did, reliable as sunrise, bringing coffee and food, and a presence that made the clinic feel less lonely, even in the small hours before dawn. On the 8th day after Bailey had been admitted, Sarah made the decision that the puppy was stable enough to go home. His blood work was normal, his energy was good, and he needed to be reunited with Isabella more than he needed continued hospitalization. She called Marco at noon, her heart lighter than it had been in over a week. "He's ready," she said when Marco answered, and she could hear the smile in her own voice. "You can bring Isabella to pick him up this afternoon." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Sarah thought the call had dropped. Then she heard Marco's breathing, rough and unsteady, and realized he was struggling to speak past the emotion clogging his throat. "Thank you," he finally managed, his voice raw. "God, Sarah, thank you. I can't." "You don't have to," Sarah said gently. "Just bring her by around 3. I'll have Bailey ready." Isabella's face when she walked into the clinic that afternoon and saw Bailey standing on his own, tail wagging, was something Sarah knew she would remember for the rest of her life. The little girl screamed with joy and dropped to her knees, gathering the puppy carefully into her arms, while tears of happiness streamed down her cheeks. Bailey licked her face enthusiastically, his entire back end wiggling with the force of his wagging tail, and Isabella laughed and sobbed and held him as though she would never let him go. Marco stood in the doorway watching his daughter, and when he looked at Sarah, his eyes were suspiciously bright. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into a hug that lifted her off her feet, his face buried in her hair for just a moment before he set her down carefully. "You kept your promise," he said roughly, his hands still on her shoulders. "You saved him. You actually saved him." "He saved himself," Sarah said, but she was smiling, unable to contain her own joy and relief. He's a fighter, just like someone else I know. Marco's expression softened, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might kiss her. But then Isabella was calling for him, asking if they could take Bailey to the park, and the moment passed. Marco stepped back, his hands falling away from her shoulders, but the warmth in his eyes remained. "Dinner," he said firmly. "Tomorrow night. Let me take you to dinner. As a thank you, and as—" He paused, something vulnerable flashing across his features. "As more than that, if you want." Sarah's heart stuttered in her chest, her mind already providing a dozen reasons why this was a bad idea. He was a client. He was involved in things she didn't want to know about. They came from completely different worlds, but all of those reasons felt distant and insubstantial compared to the way her chest expanded with warmth when she looked at him, the way the past 8 days had felt like something precious and rare was growing between them. "Yes," she said simply, and watched his face transform with a smile that made him look years younger and infinitely more dangerous in an entirely different way. Isabella ran over to them then, Bailey clutched carefully in her arms, her face shining with happiness. "Thank you, Dr. Sarah," she said earnestly. "You're the best doctor in the whole world. You kept your promise. You saved my best friend." Sarah crouched down to Isabella's level and gently stroked Bailey's head, the puppy's tail still wagging frantically. "You're very welcome, sweetheart. But remember, Bailey still needs lots of rest and gentle care for a few more weeks. Can you help take care of him?" Isabella nodded vigorously, her expression solemn with the weight of this new responsibility. "I'll take such good care of him, I promise." "I know you will," Sarah said, and when she stood, Marco was watching her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. They left together, Isabella chattering happily about all the things she would show Bailey when they got home, and Sarah stood in the empty clinic, feeling lighter than she had in months. She thought about Marco's smile, about the promise of tomorrow night's dinner, about the way her impossible promise to a desperate little girl had somehow led to something she hadn't known she was searching for. Her phone buzzed with a text. "Tomorrow, 7 p.m. I'll pick you up, and Sarah, thank you for everything." She saved the message, smiling to herself, and went to clean the exam room where this had all started. In the quiet of her clinic, surrounded by the familiar smells of antiseptic and the soft hum of equipment, Sarah found herself hoping that this was just the beginning of their story.